Welcome to Untold Slave Stories. This 1890 family portrait was uncovered, and historians were shocked when they zoomed in on the mother's hand. The afternoon sunlight slipped through the dusty windows of Riverside Antiques, throwing long shadows over rows of forgotten furniture. Thomas Reed wiped his hands on his apron as he looked over the estate sale items that had arrived that morning from a demolished row house in South Philadelphia. Most of it was nothing special. Chipped plates, faded quilts, stacks of yellowed newspapers. Then something caught his eye. Resting against a cracked mirror was a large wooden frame. If these forgotten stories touch your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And before you continue watching, write your good name and the name of your beautiful country in the comments. Let the world know you were here. The glass was foggy with age as Thomas lifted it carefully. Behind the dirty glass was a formal Victorian-era family portrait. The sepia colors had faded, but the image was still sharp. A serious father stood behind a seated mother, with 3 children placed neatly around them, all wearing their best clothing. Thomas carried the frame to his workbench near the window, where the natural light revealed more detail. The father wore a dark suit with a stiff collar. The children stared at the camera with stiff, uneasy expressions. But it was the mother who held his attention. She sat straight, her dress richly decorated with lace. Her face was striking but worn, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look beyond the camera. Her right hand tightly held the arm of the chair. Thomas had handled hundreds of old photographs. At first glance, this one seemed normal, maybe worth $50 to a collector. But something bothered him, a feeling sharpened by 20 years in the trade. He took out his jeweler's loupe and examined the photo closely, starting with the embossed studio mark. Whitmore and Sons Photography, Philadelphia, 1890. Then he focused on the mother's hands. Even through the faded tones, something looked wrong. The skin appeared rough and uneven. There were marks, not gentle wrinkles, but harsher damage. Thomas straightened, his pulse rising. He needed a closer look. He carefully removed the backing from the frame and took the original photograph to his photography station, where he used a high-resolution scanner. The scanner hummed softly. When the file appeared on his computer, Thomas zoomed in on the mother's right hand until it filled the screen. His breath stopped. The hand was covered in scars, deep, obvious injuries, burns that had healed badly, leaving the skin thick and discolored. The fingers curved slightly, as if they could no longer fully straighten. Across the back of the hand were small, round puncture marks, arranged in a strange, almost patterned way. Thomas leaned back, stunned. In all his years he had never seen anything like this. The portrait was clearly meant to show the family at their best, yet the mother's hand told a story of pain that didn't belong in such an image. The next morning, Thomas went to the Philadelphia City Archives, where centuries of records were kept in carefully controlled rooms. He had called ahead, and boxes of city directories and records from 1890 were waiting. The reading room was silent. Sitting at a long wooden table, Thomas slowly turned the fragile pages of an 1890 business directory. His finger moved down the list of photography studios until he found it. Whitmore and Sons, 1247 Chestnut Street, Fine Portrait Photography, established 1878. He wrote down the address and moved on to tax records. Whitmore and Sons had done well, paying high taxes through the 1890s, before closing in 1903. Their business records, however, were listed as destroyed in a fire in 1904. Thomas felt his first real lead disappear. Without customer records, identifying the family would be difficult. Frustrated, he leaned back just as an archivist approached. "Finding what you're looking for?" she asked. Her name tag read, Patricia Morrison. "Not exactly," Thomas said, showing her the high-resolution printout. "I'm trying to identify this family." The photo was taken at Whitmore and Sons in 1890, but their records were lost. Patricia studied the image carefully, her gaze stopping on the mother's hand. "May I?" she asked, lifting her magnifying glass. She examined the photo for several long moments. When she looked up, her expression was different. "That hand," she said quietly, "those burns and puncture marks. I've seen injuries like this in industrial accident reports from that time." "Industrial accidents?" Thomas leaned forward. Patricia explained that the 1890s were harsh for factory workers, especially women in textile and garment factories. Women worked 12 to 14 hours a day on dangerous machines, burns from steam presses, puncture wounds from sewing needles. These injuries were common. She paused. But women with damage this severe rarely sat for formal portraits. Studio photos were expensive. "This family looks upper middle class," Thomas said. "So what does that mean?" Patricia thought for a moment. "There's someone you should speak with. Dr. Helen Vasquez at Temple University. She specializes in labor history, especially women's work during Philadelphia's industrial period." Thomas wrote down the name. "Is there anything else that might help?" "Without a name, searching census records could take months," Patricia said. "But look at the mother's dress, the fabric, the lace. If she was a factory worker, wearing a dress like that would have been a big deal. Maybe the only fine dress she owned." Thomas looked again at the photo, seeing it differently now. "Dr. Vasquez might recognize something," Patricia added. She had studied hundreds of images of factory workers from that era. Later that day, Thomas left with more questions than answers. As he walked to his car, he wondered about the woman with the scarred hands. Was she proud when she sat for the portrait, or hiding her pain? Dr. Helen Vasquez's office at Temple University was crowded with books, file boxes, and framed photographs of factory floors. Thomas knocked, and a voice called, "Come in." Dr. Vasquez, in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair tied back, looked up with curiosity. Thomas introduced himself and placed the print on her desk. Dr. Vasquez put on her glasses and leaned in. Nearly a minute passed in silence. When she finally looked up, her face had gone pale. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly. "At an estate sale in South Philadelphia." She stood and pulled a thick folder from a cabinet, spreading out old photographs of women working at sewing machines and steam presses, bent over cutting tables. Their faces were tired, their clothes plain. "Look at their hands," she said. Thomas leaned closer. In every image where hands were visible, he saw scars, burns, and deformities similar to those in the portrait. "These are garment workers from the 1890s, Dr. Vasquez said. Conditions were terrible. Long hours, low pay, constant danger. Steam presses caused deep burns. Sewing machines often broke needles, sending metal into workers' hands." She tapped Thomas's photo. "But this woman is different. She has the injuries of a factory worker, yet she's dressed like someone from a higher class. That dress alone would cost months of wages." "So how do you explain it?" Thomas asked. Dr. Vasquez leaned back, thinking, maybe she worked in a factory and Ata married into a better life, or maybe something else was going on. She explained that by the late 1880s, labor movements were growing. Workers began demanding safer conditions. It was risky. Organizers were fired, blacklisted, sometimes attacked. She showed Thomas newspaper clippings from 1889 and 1890. Headlines spoke of strikes led mostly by women. Most failed, and leaders suffered the consequences. "You think she was an organizer?" Thomas asked. "It's possible," Dr. Vasquez said. "Those injuries suggest years of factory work. If you can identify her, you may uncover a story that history forgot." At the Pennsylvania Historical Society on Locust Street, Thomas gained access to industrial records from the 1880s and 1890s. An archivist named Robert brought out boxes from the Hartley Garment Company. Thomas explained his search. "These records aren't easy," Robert warned. Thomas opened the ledgers filled with cramped handwriting. Names, wages, hours, steam press operators earning $4.50 a week. Women injured, wages cut, work resumed as soon as possible. Casual cruelty filled the pages. After hours of reading, Robert returned with a thin folder. There was a strike in 1890. The company kept notes. Inside was a newspaper clipping dated May 15, 1890. The headline read, "Lady garment workers demand better treatment, walk off jobs." One line stood out. The strike was led by Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan, age 29, a steam press operator with nearly 8 years at the factory. She presented demands and was immediately fired and removed by police. Thomas felt his pulse race. The name fit, the age fit. Another memo listed suspected organizers. At the top, Elizabeth Brennan, ringleader. Beside her name, a note read, "Blacklisted. Do not rehire under any circumstances." Thomas leaned back, his thoughts racing. He had finally found her name. Over the knee. XT week. He carefully put together pieces of Elizabeth's life using broken and incomplete records. The 1900 census showed Elizabeth still married to James Brennan, living in a small row house in South Philadelphia with 3 children. Margaret, age 9, William, age 7, and Dorothy, age 4. But something about the timing kept bothering him. Strike records showed that Elizabeth had been fired and blacklisted in May 1890. The census was taken just a month later, in June 1890. The photograph was simply dated 1890. The dates were too close to ignore. Thomas returned to the Pennsylvania Historical Society and requested boxes containing management and personnel records. There, he found James Brennan's employment file. James Brennan, hired as floor foreman in January 1888, responsible for the cutting room and finishing department. Salary, $18 per week. $18 was far more than women workers earned, but it was still not a large income. Thomas flipped through the pages searching for notes from the strike period. Then he saw it. A short entry dated May 20th, 1890. James Brennan, foreman, resigned position, effective immediately, no reason listed. James had quit only days after Elizabeth was fired. That could not be an accident. Thomas soon found a clue explaining why. A memo dated May 18, 1890, stated that any employee found supporting or associating with strike organizers would be terminated at once, regardless of position. Thomas could picture it clearly. Elizabeth leading the strike, being fired and dragged away by police. James facing a brutal choice: turn his back on his wife or lose his job. James had chosen Elizabeth, but that choice came at a heavy cost. With both of them suddenly jobless and blacklisted, survival would have been difficult. Still, somehow, they managed to gather enough money for that formal family portrait. And by 1900, record showed James working again, this time as a warehouse supervisor. Thomas now wanted to find living relatives who might still carry family memories. He turned to modern genealogy records, searching through obituaries, birth records, and family trees. After hours of searching, he found a promising lead. William, the boy in the portrait, had lived until 1972 and had 3 children. One of them, Patricia Hughes, was still alive and living in a suburb west of Philadelphia. Thomas found her phone number. He stared at the number for a long moment, steadying himself, then dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Hello. Hello, is this Patricia Hughes? Yes, who's calling? My name is Thomas Reed. I'm an antiques dealer in Philadelphia. I've been researching a photograph I recently acquired. I believe it shows your great-grandmother, Elizabeth, and her family around 1890. I was hoping I could speak with you about her. There was a long silence. Then she said softly, Elizabeth Brennan? How did you find a photograph of her? It came from an estate sale, Thomas replied. I've uncovered some information about her role in the labor movement, and I wanted to share what I found and see if you know any family stories. Another pause followed. I'm 74 years old, Mr. Reed, Patricia said. You're the first person outside my family who has ever asked about Elizabeth. Can you come to my house? I have things I want to show you. Patricia Hughes lived in a tidy ranch-style home in Binmore, surrounded by quiet gardens resting for winter. Thomas arrived carrying the portrait, carefully wrapped. Patricia opened the door before he could knock. She was tall, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that reminded him of Elizabeth's stare. Come in, she said, leading him into a warm living room filled with books and family photographs. Let me see what you brought. Thomas gently unwrapped the portrait and placed it on the coffee table. Patricia sat down slowly, bringing a hand to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. I've heard about this photograph my whole life, but I never thought I'd see it. You knew about it? Thomas asked. My grandfather William, the little boy in the picture, used to talk about it, she said. The family lost it in the 1930s during the Depression when they had to sell their house. He always regretted that. He said it mattered, that it meant something. Tears filled Patricia's eyes as she looked at the image. Thomas explained how he noticed the damaged hand, found the strike records, and slowly uncovered Elizabeth's story. Patricia nodded as he spoke. When he finished, she stood and went to a cabinet. Elizabeth was remarkable, she said, pulling out a worn leather box. My grandfather always said she was the bravest person he ever knew. She risked everything to help the women she worked with. She set the box on the table and opened it. Inside were letters, papers, and photographs. Carefully, Patricia removed a small notebook wrapped in faded cloth. This belonged to Elizabeth, she said. Grandfather kept it his whole life. She used it during the strike to write names, plan meetings, and record demands. Thomas opened the notebook gently. The pages were filled with Elizabeth's handwriting, lists of workers, notes about injuries, descriptions of working conditions. One page listed complaints, burns from broken steam presses, no pay for injuries, wages cut during recovery, children forced to work 12-hour days. Another page showed demands, 10-hour workdays, safe machines maintained by owners, fair pay for injuries, no wage penalties while healing, and no child labor under 14. These demands were far ahead of their time, Thomas said quietly. Most of these protections didn't become law until the 1930s. Elizabeth knew what was right, Patricia said, but the factory owners had all the power. The strike lasted less than 2 weeks. Most women went back because they had no choice. Elizabeth didn't. They punished her to scare others. And James quit for her, Thomas said. Patricia smiled sadly. That's the part that always stayed with us. James had a steady job. He could have kept it if he had turned against her, but he loved her. He walked out the same day she was fired. How did they survive? Thomas asked. It was very hard, Patricia said. They borrowed money, took small jobs, struggled for a long time. She removed another photograph from the box. It showed Elizabeth older, standing in front of a small shop. Above the door was a sign reading Brennan Tailoring and Alterations. She became a seamstress again, but on her own terms, Patricia explained. She opened a small shop. It didn't make her rich, but it gave her freedom. And she never stopped supporting workers as labor movements grew in the early 1900s. Elizabeth attended meetings, supported strikes, and shared her story with younger women. Thomas looked again at the original portrait. The photograph was taken right after the strike, he said. Why would they spend money they didn't have on a formal photo? Patricia's eyes shone. That was Elizabeth's decision. She wanted proof of who they were at that moment. A woman with scarred hands from factory labor, a man who chose love and values over comfort, and children who would grow up knowing their parents stood for something. She gently touched the glass over Elizabeth's damaged hand. Elizabeth knew history forgets ordinary people, especially women and workers. She knew the factory owners would try to erase what happened, so she made sure there was evidence. She wore her best dress, lifted her head high, and let her scars be seen. Thomas felt his throat tighten. She succeeded, he said. The photograph survived. Now her story can be told. Patricia looked at him quietly. Will you tell it? Yes, Thomas said. I promise. In the days that followed, Thomas and Patricia worked together, sharing documents and family memories, slowly restoring Elizabeth Brennan's place in history. Thomas added his own research, finding old newspaper articles and historical background. Together, they learned that Elizabeth had been born in 1861 to Irish immigrant parents in Philadelphia's crowded Suffolk neighborhood. Her father worked on the docks and was killed in an accident when Elizabeth was only 12 years old. Elizabeth began working in garment factories at the age of 13 to help her family survive. By the time she was 20, she had become skilled at running steam presses, one of the most dangerous but slightly better paid factory jobs. She suffered her first serious burn at 17 when a faulty valve released scalding steam. The factory refused to cover medical care, so Elizabeth wrapped the burn in cloth and kept working. Because missing shifts meant losing wages she could not afford to lose. The burns visible on her hand in the photograph, Patricia explained, while showing Thomas a letter Elizabeth wrote in 1895, came from many accidents over the years. Each time the factory blamed Elizabeth for being careless, cut her pay, and forced her back to work before she had healed. Thomas felt sick reading it. The factory took no responsibility at all. In the 1880s and 1890s, factory owners had no legal duty to provide safe workplaces. Patricia said women like Elizabeth were treated as disposable. They found records showing that before the 1890 strike, Elizabeth had already tried to organize smaller actions. She had helped write petitions, led small groups to speak with managers, and encouraged quiet work slowdowns. Every effort had been crushed. Women involved were punished with pay cuts or fired. Still, Elizabeth did not give up. Slowly, she built trust among workers. The 1890 strike was her boldest effort yet. She secretly coordinated with women across several departments at the Hartley factory, choosing a single day when everyone would walk out together. The plan was to overwhelm management and force them to negotiate. "It almost worked," Patricia said, showing Thomas a letter Elizabeth wrote to her sister in 1891. For the first 2 days, the factory completely shut down. Management panicked. They called the police, threatened workers, and tried to force them back inside. But the women held firm because Elizabeth had convinced them they deserved better. Thomas read Elizabeth's words written in steady handwriting. She described standing outside the factory, singing hymns and folk songs, sharing stories of injuries, exhaustion, and children they barely saw because of long hours. For 2 days, she wrote, they were not disposable workers. They were human beings demanding dignity. Even though the strike failed and she lost her job forever, those 2 days mattered because they tried. Thomas asked what finally broke the strike. Patricia's face grew serious: fear and hunger. The factory brought in replacement workers from other cities and offered them slightly higher pay. Some strikers had children who were already starving. Management also spread rumors that the factory would shut down and move away if the strike continued. Slowly, women began returning to work. By the 10th day, the strike had collapsed. Elizabeth was singled out. She was publicly fired, dragged away by police, and blacklisted across the entire garment industry in Philadelphia. No factory would hire her. James was forced to resign after management threatened him. Thomas looked again at the portrait, at Elizabeth's tired but defiant face. And still, she had demanded that photograph. She had turned her firing into a statement. "Exactly," Patricia said. Elizabeth understood the power of symbols. She knew the factory owners wanted her erased and forgotten. So she did the opposite. She wore her finest dress, gathered her family, went to an expensive studio, and made sure her scarred hands were visible. She was saying, "I exist. What happened to me matters. You can fire me, but you cannot erase me." Patricia pulled out another item from the leather box. A fragile newspaper clipping from 1916. The headline read, "Veteran labor advocate Elizabeth Brennan speaks at workers' rally." The article described a large gathering of garment workers during a national push for labor reform. Elizabeth, now in her mid-50s, had been invited to speak about the 1890 strike. The article quoted her words. 26 years earlier, she said, she had stood with 40 brave women demanding basic rights, safety, fair wages, and dignity. They were defeated, fired, and threatened, but they planted a seed. Looking at the crowd before her, she said she could see that seed had grown into something unstoppable. Thomas read the article several times. She lived long enough to see change. She did. By 1916, Patricia explained, labor unions were gaining real power. New laws were protecting workers. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 had shocked the nation and exposed brutal factory conditions. Elizabeth had been proven right. Patricia showed Thomas Elizabeth's death certificate from 1932. Elizabeth lived to 71 and died peacefully at home, surrounded by children and grandchildren. James had passed away 2 years earlier. Elizabeth's final years were happy. She ran her tailoring shop until she was too old to work. She stayed close to her family, attended union meetings, and witnessed the passing of major labor laws. She knew that what she and those 40 women did in 1890 had mattered, even if they lost that battle. Thomas gathered the documents carefully, taking detailed notes. He asked about the children. Margaret became a teacher and was active in her union. William became a labor lawyer, defending workers. Dorothy became a social worker, helping struggling families. All of them carried Elizabeth's values. Patricia said Elizabeth once told her grandfather that the portrait was her most treasured possession. It showed the moment she and James chose to stand for something bigger than themselves, even though it cost them everything. It proved that ordinary people could be heroic. Thomas looked at the portrait again, understanding it fully now. The scarred hands were not just signs of pain, they were proof of courage. The fine dress and studio were not pride, they were a claim to dignity. Elizabeth's expression was not defeat, it was resolve. Thomas said he wanted to donate the photograph and all the research to a museum, so Elizabeth's story could be preserved. People needed to know what she sacrificed and achieved. Patricia agreed. It was exactly what Elizabeth would have wanted. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the Philadelphia Workers' History Museum. The restored portrait hung at eye level, lit so every detail was visible, especially Elizabeth's hands. Around it were her notebook, strike records, letters, and photographs. Visitors explored interactive displays showing factory conditions and labor history. A young woman read Elizabeth's letter with tears in her eyes. Thousands had already visited. Teachers brought students, labor unions held events. The image of Elizabeth's hands became a powerful symbol. A man thanked Thomas, saying his grandmother worked in garment factories and had similar hands. The exhibit helped him understand her suffering. Patricia whispered that this was what Elizabeth wanted. A little girl asked her mother why Elizabeth showed her injured hands. Her mother explained that Elizabeth was proud, not ashamed. She had work, ed hard, and stood up for what was right. The girl said Elizabeth looked strong. Thomas felt emotion rise. Elizabeth's story would live on. The photograph found in an estate sale had become a bridge to forgotten history, a reminder that ordinary people can change the world. Elizabeth's scarred hands, once a mark of cruelty, were now a symbol of dignity, resistance, and hope, and her story would inspire generations to come.